Okay, you're all set. You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, awesome. I'm just going to run through a little slides while we talk. So I'm just going to find those and load them, and then we'll be good to go. Okay. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So I don't know, I maybe know a few of you. I was around Gymnastics BC, I guess, prior to 2004. So it's been a while now. I grew up in Kelowna and trained a little bit in the Lower Mainland too. And then I moved out to Toronto in 2004. I trained with Dave Ross and some of the other folks like helped me with double mini, Teresa, and so many people really, but tons of people kind of helped me out with lots of training out here as well. So I guess I retired from trampoline in 2008, but I grew up in BC and I did artistic gym and trampoline out there. So I have a soft spot for BC in general, but of course for all of you involved in gymnastics out there. I have a bit of contact with Kurt and Sam at Shasta, but other than that, I haven't seen too many of you for a long time. So since leaving the sport, I've been pretty involved in mostly women's health and trying to promote like the healthiest version of athletics for women that I can. And so I kind of did my master's in physiology and looked at the relationship between exercise and restrictive eating and hormone levels and how that changes neurochemistry. And then I ended up going on and in my PhD, looking at retirement and trying to understand like the detraining process, how that impacts people, identity in sport. And so now what I'm really trying to do is just make sure that for our female athletes, for everyone, but for our female athletes in particular, just because that's been kind of my area of research and expertise, is that we're making sure that our young girls and women are getting adequate nutrition and are learning the appropriate emotional coping skills well through sport. So kind of this idea of, building sport to be something that promotes all around wellness and well-rounded people, even if it's elite level sport, because sometimes I think we sacrifice personal health and wellness sometimes in elite sport. So that's been what I've kind of been up to around here. I work with lots of the national team kids and so lots of youth athletes who are just kind of up and coming, a few athletes and individuals with disordered eating. But today we are going to talk about sports psych, and in particular around trampoline, double mini, tumbling. And there are some specifics that are more relevant to trampoline, but I really find that a lot of the sports psych strategies that I work with some of my athletes on when I'm talking about performance kind of optimization are pretty relevant for a really broad spectrum of athletes, whether they're elite, whether they're masters, whether they're really young. There seem to be some really common themes that are important and relevant. So we're going to talk about that. Now, I know a lot of you, especially those of you who are very experienced, I'm doing I'm doing some talks for Gymnastics Canada too. And, you know, I look at the group of coaches that I'm talking to and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, like these coaches are sports psychologists. Like they get it. And I don't, you know, I'm preaching to the choir and I'm telling you stuff that you already know, but hopefully I'm going to try and speak to some of the basics, some of the things I notice a lot in practice, especially with my trampoline athletes and my gymnasts. And then hopefully you guys can take what you will from it. And if you have any questions that seem more specific or things that you wish for me to talk about in more detail, I'm happy to do that as well. So just a disclaimer, I have 3 kids and they're in the house right now. So sometimes I had one call a couple weeks ago where I had to get up and go deal with something, but for the most part, hopefully everyone will behave themselves. Okay, so this is kind of like an old school graph about getting into the zone where we ideally want to be in terms of arousal or activation when we're competing. So I think for the most part, you guys likely will notice this with your athletes, is that I think generally there's a trend towards athletes being overactivated. So they're a bit too aroused when they get to a competition, in the sense that they got on the event and rather than being sort of in control, feeling energetic, they can sometimes they've crossed this threshold to the point where they're nervous and they're feeling either a sense of performance anxiety, they're experiencing some somatic symptoms around, you know, sometimes it's like dry mouth, pounding heart, shaking legs. That's, you know, the shaking legs is a really hard one for trampoline in particular, well, for all sports really, but trampoline and in particular, especially fine with a compulsory, because then you have an athlete who's trying to be kind of controlled and calm and bounce high, but sometimes their timing's off. So what I spend a lot of time talking to my trampolinists about is just trying to figure out what it looks like when they're at a level of anxiety or arousal which feels really good to them and where they feel like they can perform optimally. And for the most part, my athletes that come to me are feeling upset or frustrated because they're training pretty well, but when they get to competition, they're feeling like they're a bit too anxious and it's preventing them from performing their very best in that particular circumstance. So I do typically find that with double mini and tumbling, it's a little bit easier because you can translate the intensity of that arousal into just a GER, like a giver, right? Whereas on trampoline, and especially because we start with compulsory, which I've heard maybe changing or is changing, at least at some of the higher levels, you do need to be in control, and it needs to be a sense of waiting in the bed or a bit more relaxed when you get on the bed. So this can be problematic for athletes. And I think for the most part, they just don't like the feeling of being super jacked up and really, really overactivated. So this is one thing we talk about a lot. And I think the ramifications of talking about this, often because we start with this as a framework, it bleeds into some of the other really important things that we need to consider when we're thinking about athletes and just general athlete well-being. So when I'm thinking about how do we get athletes to kind of feel their very best and perform their very best in a competitive setting, I often go to, what are you thinking right before you get on the event? What is your mindset like around competition? And are you able to control in some ways the thinking right before you get on that event and the preceding hours, days up to that? Do you know what your thoughts are? How do those thoughts look? And how do those thoughts that you're having impact your physical, cognitive, emotional being? And then I think the awareness around that thought and thinking is really important in terms of just everyday life. So the ability for an athlete to start to learn and hone this skill, the ability to be able to say, you know, I'm feeling nervous and I have a reflective ability to think about what it is that's causing me to feel that nervousness. That reflective ability and that ability to sort of think about thoughts and the awareness of thinking is extremely useful just in everyday life, whether it be through relationship, in school, in academics and career. The ability to actually have an awareness of thought, especially when we're talking about like mental health or just general well-being, the ability to have that awareness around your thinking is really important. So I like to kind of connect these things when I'm talking to athletes. I'm like, yeah, it's, having this sort of mindful approach to understanding where your thoughts go before you're getting on the event that you want to do really well at is important because you do want to perform well, but having that awareness and that reflexivity and that awareness is also really important just because that's going to make you a more well-rounded person, a more reflective person, and a better able to control yourself in whatever environment you end up in, whether it's with little children that you're trying to control we're not always patient with little kids, or you find yourself in a position where you're frustrated. Are you aware of what thoughts you're having, and are you able to be mindful and aware of them and then act appropriately based on the circumstance? So I think this is sort of a starting place when we're thinking of kind of basic sports-like tools. I kind of start with this idea. What does it feel like to you when you're performing really well? And I'll often talk to athletes about, like, just start at a place of what did that performance feel like when you were doing really well? Do you remember a time when you nailed it, when you can hardly remember the time passing, that it felt like you got on the event and time disappeared, and you ended your routine and it had gone really well? What did that feel like? What were you thinking? What were the sensations that you experienced in those moments? And I mean, sometimes we refer to this idea of like flow state, of losing a sense of time and space, of being completely absorbed in a task. And there's this notion of being present in the moment. And I think, though, that's certainly something to strive towards, is getting to that place in a competitive environment. But I think sometimes it's enough for us to just be working towards having constructive and useful thoughts while we're competing. Never mind trying to get us to flow state or get into this place where we're not actually thinking about much and our body kind of takes over. So I think in the end, we do want athletes to try and get to this spot where their body just kind of takes over as automatic. But I think for a lot of athletes, what we want to be doing is aiming to have them shift their thinking from things that are out of their control, distractions, towards stuff that's more in their control, so that they can at least be in a kind of more constructive state of mind. And then from there, what you hope is that the athlete sort of naturally gains the confidence and the comfort in a competitive environment so that they can pop into that sort of flow state. And I think that's an evolving state of being. I think even for the very best athletes who are very comfortable, confident competitors, they occasionally have to drop back into the sense of, I'm going to be very deliberate about my thinking right now and what I'm going to focus on. And sometimes they actually are thinking through their routines. It's not just flowing. It's not easy. So I think for a lot of athletes, it's about just making sure that we know where to put, that we recognize and can be aware of the negative thinking or the thinking about extrinsic variables or things we're not in control of or distractions, being aware of that, and then being able to shift our thinking towards those kind of more productive things that we would like our athletes to be thinking about in the moment. And I think, I'm not sure, it'd be interesting to hear your opinion on this, but I certainly have noticed with the athletes that I work with, that there's a bit of a trend in the sense that oftentimes when athletes are very young, so say under the age of 12 or 13, they often compete fairly seamlessly, in that they show up, they get on the event, they perform their routine, and that's it. They go and do basically, they sometimes make mistakes, but they're making mistakes generally in a fairly predictable manner, in the sense that, like, maybe they haven't trained as much as they should have, or their routine is not up to snuff or whatever. And then especially if an athlete's been quite successful in their young years, and have this sort of sense of success and achievement and wanting to do well built into their sense of who they are, and wanting to continue that because it feels good to do well. Sometimes when they get into that developmental stage, 13, 14, 15, 16, when they become much more aware of the sort of external world and judgment of others, and we become much more social beings during that time. Their brains are changing so that they're much more attuned to, social critique and the opinions of others and all of that. And when they get into that developmental phase, what I notice with a lot of my athletes is that they start to say, I used to compete so well, and now I'm psyching myself out. I don't feel confident. I feel like I get too nervous. All of those sorts of thoughts and statements start to come up for them. And sometimes for those athletes, there really does need to be a reset around how we're thinking about how we're competing. An awareness and an acknowledgement around what types of thoughts have started to creep in for you. What does that look like? What is that internal dialogue looking like for you? And how can we start to be really conscious and aware of it and make some adjustments so that you're able to perform your very best? Because what I always say to my athletes is, look, you can focus on the externals. Like, you can focus on winning the medal, getting a ranking, qualifying for the event, winning the Olympics, whatever it is whatever event you're doing. But the most effective way to actually get there is to think about the things that you actually need to do to create a beautiful, amazing routine that's up to the best of your ability. So how do we actually create that for you? So I think the first thing I often try and emphasize with athletes when I'm having this conversation with them, because oftentimes athletes feel pretty distressed about this idea that they feel out of control. They feel like they come in and they're pretty vulnerable about it. It's like, I'm training so hard. I get to competition. I don't know how to control my thinking. I feel extremely nervous. I have to go up in front of all these people. I really want to do well. I have a lot riding on it. My identity is interwoven. They might not say these things, but you can feel that they're really baked into it. And so I think the first thing I always start with is it's very normal to, when in a position where you feel like you're kind of under threat, or that your sense of who you are is under threat, or that other people are going to be watching you, that you have even greater breaks in concentration than you normally would. And I'll often say to them, look, like, our brains are wired to be distractible. They're supposed to be like that. And but the good news is that now that you know, and now that you've admitted that you're nervous about that, or you're vulnerable about that, we can start to work on it. And I often say, there have been amazing champions who have felt distracted in very big competitions, and they've been able to figure out how to stay in the moment, focus on the process, and figure out how to get their body to perform in a way that feels beautiful and seamless, and is able to carry out the capacities and the competencies that that athlete actually has. So I think that's our main goal, right? Is to make the athlete feel at home, feel comfortable with the fact that they're not weird or abnormal or strange for having this stress around competitive environments, and that it's completely normal. And then also have them have this recognition that while it's very normal, and while the solution might be easy, it's simple, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work. And especially if an athlete has had an experience where they've lost confidence, or felt like they've made mistakes, or been injured, or whatever it may be, sometimes it can take a really long time to reset that, and for that athlete to regain the confidence in the competitive environment, such that they can get to a place where they're actually feeling at ease, that they have a certain level of comfort, and that they can focus on the things that are going to be productive for them doing what they need to do. So I think one of the things that I often start with my athletes is let's start to think about the distractions that you're going to confront in your competitive environment. And I think sometimes athletes fear that if they confront and label and acknowledge the distractions, that those things are going to get worse. And I've never heard of a circumstance like that. I think that's sort of a fallacy that people have, that if I identify them, then they become bigger. I think it's actually usually the opposite, that when you can start to identify what those distractions are that you're going to confront in your competitive environment. And by the way, I'm talking about a competitive environment, but it's also really important for your athletes to recognize what their thought processes are like in practice as well, because you can probably think right now of an example of an athlete who, takes on, you can see it, like you can see them unraveling in practice, where it's like, okay, things are going really well, they have a couple bad turns, and then all of a sudden they're in this slump and they're tired and they don't want to do anymore and they're lacking motivation. And the ability for them to be able to recognize that pattern. What are the thoughts I'm having? What does that spiral lead me into? Where do I go when I have that thought? That's really important as well, because we know that most of our time is spent practicing, not in competition. But all that being said, having the athletes really have a powerful sense of what those internal and external distractors are going to be in the competitive environment is a really powerful tool. And I find for the athletes that I work with really, really insightful, and it emboldens them rather than taking away their power. So it's like, I want, I'll often say to them, get a piece of paper and a pen. And there is something really powerful about pen to paper as opposed to typing or writing on your iPhone. Not only because you can get distracted when you're on your iPhone, your messages are popping up or whatever, but there's a neural connection between the brain and the hand. And when you can write it down, it makes these ideas more concrete. It brings them to life in a different sort of way. So get a huge piece of paper, a big piece of paper, get your pen, and I want you to write down every single distraction that you can possibly think of that might come up for you at this competition, this upcoming competition that you're going to have. And sometimes athletes really struggle with, like, what are those things that distract me in my mind when I get to the competition? And I was talking to the I don't know what group it was, but the national gymnasts, and I was telling them a story of a young girl that I was working with who, she was very good. She was on the national team for artistic, and had struggled the last couple of competitions on beam, and she was at one particular World Cup, and she really kind of fell apart on beam. And so we had a conversation about it. I said, what are you thinking about right before you get on the event? And, what are those thoughts like? Like, she says, my legs are shaking so much. I can't, I can't function when I get on the apparatus. And so I said to her, okay, like, what is it that you're thinking before you get on the beam? And she said, well, I don't think I'm thinking about anything. Like, I'm just super nervous, and I don't know, I'm pacing. And I said, okay, well, let's work on that, because, we don't know exactly. And I don't like throwing out figures that are incorrect, but, there's been estimates between 60,000, 80,000 thoughts every single day that people have, human beings have. So if we're having 80,000 thoughts a day, say, I'm finding it really hard to believe that right before you get on the event at this World Cup, you're having no thoughts, nothing's happening. Maybe there's just a lack of awareness around that thinking. So for her and I, it's this process of trying to uncover, like, where are you going with your thinking before you're getting on that apparatus? And what are those thoughts doing to you? What is that? We know there's a relationship between having those thoughts and that being deeply connected to your nervous system, and that increasing your level of kind of somatic awareness, where you're now breathing heavy, your legs are shaking, and it feels involuntary. But when you can start to recognize that, oh, that's actually connected to the internal monologue or dialogue or whatever that I'm having, the narrative that I'm telling myself, there starts to become a little bit this greater sense of, like, okay, yeah, like I have a little bit more control over that. So for us, it took quite a while to start to unpack that thinking around, like, okay, what are you thinking before you get on the beam, and what does that look like to you? And it started to come out like, oh, I don't want to make the mistake like I made last time. I don't want to embarrass myself. You know, there's a lot riding on this comparative discussion around what other people are doing and other athletes are doing. Lots of conversation around this, the specifics of the arena, the lights, the balance beam itself, the equipment. This, if any of you have been artistic gymnasts, you know that the balance beam can be a good beam or a bad beam, depending on like how wide it feels, even though they're all the same width, but they feel different. And I think, same can be said certainly for tumbling and what the double mini feels like or what the trampoline feels like. So all of those things being included in this sense of like, what are those thoughts we're having that are going to be distracting to us? And are we aware that we're actually having them? Because if we don't even have awareness of them, it's much, much more difficult. I'm not going to say there's no way, but it's much, much more difficult to get a handle on them and reshift and refocus thinking on things that are much more productive and are going to make your competitive experience much more enjoyable. So they often say that you want to focus on the thing you want to focus on now, but you want to focus on the right thing now. So the good news is for athletes, and I often tell my young athletes, it's like you can only really focus on one thing at one time. So the good thing about that is that if you can get the right cues and you can create, whether it be a sensory kind of script that you want to create, whether you want to have cue words, which work for some athletes, whether you want to have a real focus on a breath practice, a focus on the sensory experiences around you. All of those things are going to orient you in the right now, which is great because it pulls you away from thinking about past issues, potential past failures, and future things that are going to cause anxiety. Like I want to qualify for worlds, or I really want to get X, Y, and Z score, or I want to stay on the trampoline, or whatever it is that you're thinking about. So I think the first thing that I often come to with my athletes is, can we create a bit of a practice around this? Can we start to build the muscle in our brain that helps us be more aware of the types of thoughts we're having and feel a little bit more in control of when our thoughts drift, that we recognize that our thoughts have drifted and that we're able to redirect them. So I don't know how much experience many of you have with like a mindfulness or meditative practice. I think sometimes the athletes I work with, I often try to kind of dispel this myth that it's super woo-woo and it's about Buddhist monks, and I really try and bring it back to like that gymnast story, like this isn't some abstract concept. This is this idea that in those moments, if you don't know where your thoughts are going and you have no control over them, how are you going to be able to bring them back to where you want them to be in these moments that you really care about? And these are really amazing opportunities for you to have a great experience, like to show what you've been training. And so how can we make sure that experience that you have is really amazing, and that you feel powerful and you feel strong and you feel energized and you feel like you want to attack it rather than shying away in fear? Because I think that those are two fundamentally different approaches to competing. And you can often see that in athletes who are lacking confidence, is that it's like, I want to get through this routine. I don't want to tackle it. I don't want to show everyone how fantastic my training has been. It's more like, I want to get through this, and I want to make sure that I don't make any crazy mistakes, because that's going to be embarrassing or whatever, upsetting to me. So starting with this sort of foundation of like a mindfulness meditation practice where we actually learn that skill and we start to recognize what that feels like. So just because I'm all about the sense of being applied and trying things, and certainly sports psych and performance based psychology is all Okay. So that was 1 minute. And we won't have everyone share their experience, but even if you can just reflect on the most challenging element of that, um, how quickly it was that you realized your thoughts had drifted, um, what that looked like for you. I was talking with the national guys last week, and Trevor Sterling, I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning his experience. He said, I'm always thinking, right? Like, he's so bright and he's a very analytical person. And he says, it's just very, very hard for me to actually bring my attention to my thinking, because it's like I notice when I stop and I try and focus on the breath that there's just like a lot going on. So depending on the style of athlete that you have, those are going to be some of the experiences that come up. And for many of you, you may have felt that as well. For me, it happens even when we're not fully aware that it's going on. Because oftentimes those are the thoughts that are popping in, sometimes drifting in and drifting out, that create that sense of, I think it's really important for athletes to have this sense of like, okay, that's fine. Like, if my thoughts do start to drift towards, those distractors that we talked about, like outcome, wanting to qualify for an event, wanting to place, however, there are so many distractors that can pop up for athletes, especially things that are related to their identity and feeling successful and wanting to do well. And those are completely normal things. But those things are distracting. They pull you away from what you really need to be focused on. So it's very helpful for athletes, I find, to provide them with something. It's like, okay, that's great that I can't, or that I'm not supposed to be thinking about these other things. And I often try to say, look, it's okay to think about, it's not like Rosie wasn't thinking about winning an Olympic medal when she was at the Olympics. Those thoughts are going to pop in, right? And she got press talking to her about it or whatever. Those things are going to come. But the important thing is having the awareness and the recognition that those thoughts have come, and then having a place to put your thoughts and where to focus your attention and where to place the emphasis of your thought and your emotion and your energy. So where do we put that? And I think for trampolinists, mechanical technical focuses can be really helpful. So you just have to make sure that you don't get too heady about it and you don't provide too many mechanical technical things to think about. So I often say to athletes, I don't want it to be this sort of thing where you have 10 keywords for a compulsory routine and you're totally paralyzed by the amount of analyzing you're doing about that routine. What I want it to be is this very much about the sensations you experience when that routine is going really well for you. So what I often hear from athletes is it's really like a long wait, it's a really strong lift, it's arms by my ears, it's something like that. And sorry, I'm just talking about trampoline right now, but I could provide examples for double mini as well, or tumbling. So for them, it's about creating that almost like a little movie script in their mind. What does it really feel like for me when things are going really well, when I feel really strong, when I'm having those moments on the trampoline where I feel extremely capable and confident? What does that sense in my body feel like? And for athletes, they know what that is. I mean, many of you have likely been athletes in the past, and you can probably, even if it's been a long time, you probably still have that embodied sense of what it means when you hit something right. Like, I can still imagine what it felt like to connect with like the first part of the double mini tramp. Like, I know I have an internal memory, a neurological memory of what that feels like to hit that at a really good angle so that you're going to get a lot of height and pop and power. So I try to, when I'm thinking about work with athletes, I'm trying to get away a little bit from the words, because athletes sport isn't really about words. It's not really even like that cognitive. It's very embodied. It's about what your physical sensations are heightened to, what the whole neurological system is experiencing in that moment. So I'll often say to them, can you imagine in your body and in your mind what it really feels like when you are bouncing for your compulsory routine and you know that that first trick is going to be set up perfectly? Do you have like an internal script about what that feels like? And I was like, yes, of course. So I say to them, sometimes you need a cue word to just remind you that that's what you want to think about. So maybe that's wait. And when you say wait, can you imagine that sense of like, that waiting in the bed, and then what's going to come of that? When I think of lift, when you think of power, when you use the words, not just as words, but as a connector to a sensory experience around what it means to wait in the bed, and to create like a beautiful, competent skill or performance or routine. So I caution athletes against having too many words, cue words. Like it can get really heady, and athletes can get distracted by it. So coming up with very few things, very few words to think about, very few sensory things to think about, but the ones that really feel impactful to them. And I think that they'll probably be able to identify those things for themselves. I think sometimes too, for athletes, if they get tripped up by that, they can also think about how, and this has worked for a few athletes that I've worked with, how they want the trampoline. You could think of the tumbling strip or the double mini as well, how they want to impact the equipment. So that seems a bit abstract, but can you get them to imagine, like, what do you want that event to do? Like, what do you want the physical apparatus to do when you hit it? And do you know what that action is that you need to do in order to make that happen? So the experience of nerves, because, now I have to perform and there's a bit of fear. I don't want to make a mistake. So noticing you've had that thought, accepting that it's come, and shifting focus towards what is that movie script that I know I need to focus on in order to ground myself in what is going to make me do the best anyway. I always say that to my athletes, like, you don't have to focus on the outcome, because if you do your thoughts that distract you and pull you away, pull it back. For some athletes, they find it really difficult to focus on the mechanical, technical elements of their skills. And so there's a typo in here. It says central aspects of the water. So clearly I'd use this PowerPoint at some point for swimmers, who I work with a lot. But it doesn't have to be, this is relevant for everyone. So it's like using your senses. If the athlete feels like they get too heady by thinking about the skill itself, or even the movement of the trampoline or the equipment around them, they can start to just open their gaze up, or their experience, bringing their sensory experience back to their body. So say they're in the corral preparing to compete, and they notice they're getting pulled away by something extrinsic or uncontrollable. Can you pull it back to something sensory? What is it? What do the lights in the stadium look like? What does my leotard feel like on my body, or my bodysuit? What does the floor feel like under my feet? What is that sensory experience that I'm having? And can they, in as much detail as possible, experience that? So for you right now, likely you're sitting, you've likely forgotten that you were sitting, but can you in as much detail as possible feel the connection between where your body meets the chair, or how your feet feel on the ground? And what you'll notice when you really focus on that is that there's no space to be pulled to what happened before, what might happen in the future, that you're grounded in the current, in the present moment. So that's another way, is using those senses. Breathing, of course, is a really powerful tool, but for some athletes, especially if they're not overly experienced with the breathing, that can trip them up a bit, because what they notice when they start to breathe is that they start to get distracted by, I'm really nervous, this is a big event, and they start to have thoughts that they have a hard time calming that voice through the breath, and that they prefer to have something to kind of shift their thinking towards. That being said, some athletes do really well with the breath. They notice they've drifted and they pull it back to the breath. Notice they've drifted and pull it back to the breath. So it just depends. Of course, you can focus on relaxation and having fun. So these are some of the things that I think come up a lot for the athletes that I'm working with, especially around trampoline. And I think that, a lot of these things, they're very useful for competition, but they're also very, very useful for mental blocks, like trying to come up with a little snapshot clip of what you want that thing to feel like or look like right before you perform it. Having that visualization and that visual image can be a really powerful tool in helping you overcome mental blocks, which we know now it's not a lack of like willpower or determination or wish to do the skill. You can see that in athletes who get mental blocks on trampoline or tumbling or lose tricks. It's not that they don't want to do them. It's that their body is kind of sounding this anxiety alarm. Like it's a balk. It's a primal shutdown. I'm not doing that. So having the ability to be very mindful, starting to use mechanical technical focus, using your senses. There are, of course, lots of other tricks with mental blocks, including counting and different things. It's a different talk altogether. But I think using like a mindful approach to practice, to competition, to challenges like mental blocks, can be very useful for these athletes. So that's kind of why I start with an awareness of thinking as kind of a foundational skill for athletes to be working on. And I think the biggest place where I try and have them work on this is like absolutely just to have a very basic mindfulness practice, whether that's through like an app, like a meditation app or a breathing app. But also just trying to start to have them recognize that there's a lot going on up there, whether it be in practice or competition, and an awareness of that is really, really helpful their head around how they can optimize their performance in sport. And then, of course, hoping that those skills of that internal and reflexive awareness allows them to be a more well-balanced person outside of the realm of trampoline and tumbling. So what I wanted to talk to you guys about in terms of like a foundational baseline approach to sports psych. And I would be happy to answer any questions around more specific things that you've encountered with athletes or specific questions around some of these techniques.
In training situations, maybe lost skill syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I did a whole talk on this. I did a talk on this at Nationals last year, and there's a lot that goes into it. I can kind of give a few ideas around it. Now, I think the first thing I think about when I think about like lost skills and blocks and mental blocks and all of that in sport is the number one thing to just recognize is that the athlete's obviously not trying to lose a skill. And I think most coaches can recognize that, but it's incredibly frustrating. I think what can be even more frustrating and sometimes scary for coaches is that they can see lost skills or blocks or mental blocks being a bit contagious between athletes. So that's a very common phenomenon within sports psychology, is this recognition that athletes will actually observe their teammates having mental blocks, and then they'll not adopt them, but they'll also start struggling with mental blocks themselves. So firstly, just recognizing that that's obviously not something that an athlete wants to experience, and it is a neurological manifestation of kind of like an alarm system response. And what you might notice with athletes is that mental blocks often happen when the general level of anxiety or stress for that athlete is starting to creep up. So I work with athletes who, I'll have seen them for a mental block. I won't see them for 6 months. And then it's like 1 week before nationals and they lose all of their tricks. So I think what that tells you is that there's this sort of our nervous system and our bodies are only capable of managing so much anxiety and stress. And for a lot of athletes, especially if they're less verbal and they're less emotionally mature, they have a really difficult time processing those emotions. So they sometimes internalize them. And what can sometimes happen is that as these important needs start to creep up, that their system kind of just shuts down, and there's sort of this runaway effect where they start to really experience a lot of compounding stress, and then their body starts to shut down and they're like, I'm not doing it anymore. So I think what we talk a lot about with these athletes is oftentimes you just have to try and bring the level of general stress. Like if you can look at this athlete and say, look, there's a lot going on, whether it's there's a big event coming up or there's something else going on in their lives or whatever it is, trying to notch that back a few notches just to give their body a bit of a rest. And I often say with these athletes, like, throw everything at it. Like it's not just psychological and emotional, it's also physiologic. So it's like Epsom salts baths, breathing techniques, relaxation strategies. All of these things are going to be important in helping athletes actually cope with lost skills, with balking, with mental blocks, because it's not just about that particular skill. It's about a holistic understanding of what's going on with that athlete. So trying to notch that back as best as possible. And then I often, and notching back stress also is like trying to prevent getting super frustrated, trying to prevent the implication that the athlete isn't like, just go for it. Like that, it's very hard because it's really, really frustrating when athletes have mental blocks, but the implication that they're not trying hard, because that's often part of the stress around it, is this fear of social judgment and of all of that. So it kind of can compound the issue sometimes. And then oftentimes it takes us like a very methodical trial and error process of rebuilding skills. So going back to basics, a billion and one progressions, whether that be like throw pits, spotting tools, spotting belts, into foam pits, every progression known to mankind until the person is just doing the progressions and then only inching forward when the body is relaxed enough to actually do it. And creating a bit of a regime around when a skill is lost. This is what we do. We go back. I don't know if many of you guys know Sam Sandell, who trained at Skyriders. She struggled with lost skills for a huge amount of her career, but by the end of her career, she could lose all of her skills and get all of her skills within one training. So I think there's actually almost a confidence that can come for athletes when there's a huge amount of anxiety when they first lose skills, but a huge amount of confidence that can also come when they recognize that I can actually work through that and there are ways in which I can go about regaining skills. So sorry, that's kind of an abbreviated response, but hopefully that gives you a couple ideas around what to do. Like certainly counting, different types of counting around the skill, visualizing the skill, huge amounts of progressions, notching down the anxiety around just training and competition in general. That's easier said than done because it's like a week before nationals. It's like, how are you going to go back to basics at that moment in time? So a lot of the time, these things, I think probably I miss the biggest thing is the recognition that that's actually a really powerful opportunity for learning for the athlete. And that I really believe that sport is not just about like winning the medal at the event or, it's so much more about just building the resiliency, the strength, the personal skills for life. So when you experience something like that and it's extremely frustrating, is that athlete able to work through it and gain confidence from that struggle as opposed to, quitting or feeling totally dejected. So I think that would be the big message surrounding lost skills. But I'm also happy, like I think I have like a 10-point checklist or something that I can send out if you're interested in ideas around blocked skills or lost skills or fear.
Perfect. Okay, another question came through. Oh gosh, there it is. At what age would you recommend starting mindfulness practices?
Yeah, so this is a really good question because I think there's just like a natural developmental trajectory in terms of how capable young people are at internalizing, practicing, being diligent about these sorts of things. Now, I think it depends on the person, of course. I would say 15, 16, 17, they begin to be able, from my experience, I've noticed that they're much more able to engage in a practice like this and see value in it. I think it is a little bit harder when they're younger. But that being said, I think you can try to integrate different types of mindfulness into like maybe a conditioning routine where all like, so you have a younger group of athletes, you know, have athletes they're doing hollow body rocks or something. And can you guys spend some time thinking about, I don't know, this is like totally off the cuff, so it's a bit butchered, but can you guys feel what it's like to have your back like touching the floor and rocking back and forth, and what do your toes feel like starting to try and integrate some ideas around what it means to be mindful of your thought, even with your younger athletes. But you know, I think I talk about this a fair amount with, you know, when I'm talking with my coaches. It's sports psychology stuff. It's so much more about just having an athlete feel its importance and understand its worth and actually get into the habit of doing it. It's much like this stuff isn't rocket science. It's, you know, a lot of the suggestions I make are quite basic, but it's a lot more just about trying to figure out at what age and stage an athlete is ready, and at what age and stage or developmental level or maturity they're ready to commit to something so that they can actually have some benefit from it. I think oftentimes athletes do things because they're supposed to or they're told to do them. I notice that particularly with my artistic gymnasts. It's like they will do whatever they're supposed to do, but you know, I really try and have this be a practice. It's like, this is all yours, because you know, when you're 25 and no one is watching you, what's the plan? Like, is this about your life, or is this about something that someone wants you to do? So